Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you some of the oldest Bible manuscripts discovered so far. In my series on Who Wrote the Bible, I talked a lot about when each book of the Bible was written. However, keep in mind that in no case do we have the original versions of those books. What we have instead are manuscripts, which are copies or copies of copies that usually date to hundreds of years after the originals. So, how old are the manuscripts that we have, and how reliable are they? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But first, let me tell you about our sponsor, MyHeritage. If you want to learn more about your family's history, MyHeritage is currently offering a 14-day free trial followed by a 50% discount. Just use the link in the description or pinned comment. One of the best things about MyHeritage is that it gives you access to over 16 billion records. That includes primary sources like birth certificates, military records, and newspaper articles. And MyHeritage automatically finds these documents as you build your tree. One of the documents that I found is this page from the 1871 Census of Canada, taken just 4 years after Canada became a country. On it is listed my great-great-grandparents, Jacob and Lucy Baker, as well as my great-grandfather, Gabriel Baker, who was only 9 years old at the time. From this record, I learned that they were Baptists, that they were of German descent, and that Jacob worked as a fisherman and farmer. My wife found this record from Ellis Island, dated July 18, 1903. It lists the passengers who arrived in New York from Antwerp on a ship named the Kroonland. Number 26 on the list is her great-grandfather, Yitzhak Yosvein. The document shows that he was Jewish, that he came from the Russian Empire, and that he arrived with $7.50. If you'd like to discover similar records about your own family, just click the link in the description or pinned comment to start a free trial at MyHeritage right now. Okay, back to the oldest Bible manuscripts. I'm going to be talking about them in the form of a top 10 countdown. So coming in at number 10 is the Masoretic Text, represented by two very important manuscripts, Codex Aleppo and Codex Leningradensis. Up until 1947, Codex Aleppo was the oldest complete copy of the Tanakh in Hebrew, which is what Christians call the Old Testament. So originally, it included the complete Torah, the prophets, and the writings. For many centuries, this manuscript was kept at the Central Synagogue in Aleppo, Syria. However, in 1947, during anti-Jewish riots, it went missing. It resurfaced about a decade later in Israel, but when it did, only 60% of the manuscript remained. That surviving 60% is now located in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. It dates to around the year 920 CE and was created by a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes, hence the name the Masoretic Text. But since the Aleppo Codex is no longer complete, the oldest complete copy of the Masoretic Text is now Codex Leningradensis, located in St. Petersburg, Russia, which was formerly known as Leningrad. The Leningrad Codex dates to the year 1008, so not quite as old as the Aleppo Codex, but still more than 1,000 years old. However, as we learned in the Who Wrote the Bible series, most of the Tanakh was written between the years 650 and 350 BCE, which means that the Leningrad Codex is actually closer in time to us today than it is to the original authors of its content. Now, please note that the Masoretic Text is not the oldest copy of the Tanakh. It's the oldest complete copy in the original Hebrew. The Septuagint, which is older, is also a complete copy of the Tanakh, but it's written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And then, of course, there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are even older. They are written in Hebrew, but they are not complete. So if we're looking for the oldest complete copy of the Tanakh, or Old Testament, in Hebrew, That would be the Masoretic Text, represented nowadays by Codex Leningradensis. This is the text that provides the foundation for the Old Testament section in every modern translation of the Bible. Okay, coming in at number 9 are the 4 great Unseals: Codex Vaitcanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Ephraemi-Rescriptus. These 4 manuscripts were created by early Christians and thus contain both the Old Testament written in Greek, known as the Septuagint, or LXX for short, as well as the New Testament, including the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Pauline epistles, and the other New Testament books. All, of course, are written in Greek, and some also include several apocryphal books. So basically, these 4 manuscripts are the only 4 copies of the complete Bible that have survived from ancient times. They are called Unseals because they are written in uppercase letters. Of the 4, Codex Vaitcanus is probably the oldest, dating to around 325 CE. It gets its name from the fact that it has been kept at the Vatican since the 1440s. Nowadays, however, anyone in the world can view it using the Vatican's online digital library. I'll leave a link to it in the description. The next oldest of the 4 is Codex Sinaiticus, dating to around 350 CE. It was rediscovered in 1844 at a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, but is now primarily housed at the British Library in London. You can view this one online too. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. The other 2, Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Ephraemi-Rescriptus, were both likely created in Alexandria, Egypt, during the early 400s CE, but both eventually wound up in Constantinople. However, from there, they wound up in the hands of the British and the French, respectively, and thus today can be found in London and Paris. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Old Testament portions of these manuscripts are actually quite a bit older than the Masoretic Text. However, they are written in Greek, which means that they are actually translations of the original Hebrew. The Greek version is called the Septuagint, or LXX, because the original Torah portion was said to have been translated by 70 Jewish scribes back in the Ptolemaic period. Now, when the Greek Septuagint is compared to the Hebrew Masoretic Text, there are some minor differences. This has led to some debate over which one is closer to the original. On the one hand, the Septuagint manuscripts are much older, but on the other hand, they are not in the original Hebrew. Generally speaking, the Masoretic Text is seen as being the more authoritative one, with differences from the Septuagint being mentioned in the footnotes in many modern translations. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, the 4 great Unseals represent the oldest complete versions of all 27 books put together. However, as we're about to see, when it comes to each individual book, we do have versions that are even older. Thus, when it comes to the standard Greek text that is used as the foundation for most modern translations, none of these codices are used alone in the same way that Codex Leningradensis is for the Old Testament. Instead, most scholars today use what's called the Nestle-Aland text, which is a version of the Greek New Testament made about 100 years ago by comparing all the various manuscripts available and figuring out what the original text was most likely to be. Okay, moving along to number 8. The Bodmer Papyri. This is a collection of many manuscripts, purchased in 1931 in Egypt by an antiquities collector named Martin Bodmer. Included in this set are P66, an almost complete copy of the Gospel of John, and P75, an almost complete copy of Luke, as well as half of John. Both date to the early 200s CE, making them at least 100 years older than the versions of the Gospels included in the 4 great Unseals. So these 2 Bodmer Papyri in particular are notable. in that they represent the oldest, mostly complete copies of a gospel. Nowadays, P66 is located in Switzerland and P75 is at the Vatican. Also included in the Bodmer Papyri is a good portion of the Book of Psalms in Greek, as well as 1st and 2nd Peter, several apocryphal books, and even a bit of Homer's Iliad. Coming in at number 7 is another large collection of manuscripts known as the Chester Beady Papyri, named yet again after a collector of antiquities. Most of these were also rediscovered in Egypt, but in this case they were brought to Dublin, Ireland, where they are housed to this day, although a few key pages ended up at the University of Michigan. Included in the Chester Beady collection is a manuscript called P46, which is around the same age as the two Bodmer manuscripts I mentioned. However, in this case, P46 represents the oldest, mostly complete copy we have of the Pauline epistles. The collection also includes partial copies of other books, both from the Septuagint and the New Testament. Number 6 is the Magnane Fragments, also known as P64 and P67. These are all tiny pieces from a now lost copy of the Gospel of Matthew. They were found in Egypt in 1901, but are now located at Magdalene College in Oxford, hence their name. It is possible that these fragments are even older than the oldest manuscripts in the Bodmer and Chester Beady collections. At one point, they were even thought to perhaps date all the way to the 1st century. However, most scholars now place them in the 2nd century, if not the 3rd. At number 5, we have the Oxyrincus Papyri, a massive collection of manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1898. They are named after the city of Oxyrincus, where they were found, which was once the 3rd largest city in Egypt. 90% of the documents were actually stuff that most of us would find quite boring, like census returns and tax assessments. But there were also texts from famous Greek writers, such as Sophocles, Sappho, Euripides, and even Aristotle. And of course, there were bits and pieces from the Greek Bible. Most important are P90, a section from John, and P104, a section from Matthew. These both date to around 150 CE and are thus the 2nd and 3rd earliest New Testament fragments found so far. The earliest New Testament fragment comes in at number 4. It's known as the Rhylands Papyrus, or P52. It dates perhaps as early as 125 CE, which means that it was maybe created a mere 30 years after the original. It's pretty small though, containing only a few lines from John chapter 18 on each side. It was found in Egypt in 1920 and is currently on display at the University of Manchester. Okay, this means that we're now finished with the New Testament. Therefore, the top 3 manuscripts are all going to be Hebrew documents that contain portions of the Old Testament, or Tanakh. Number 3 is the Nash Papyrus, found in 1902, once again in Egypt. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nash Papyrus was the oldest fragment we had of the Hebrew Bible, dating to around 150 BCE. However, the Nash Papyrus only contains a very small portion of the Torah, mostly just the 10 Commandments and the Shema prayer. It's now located at Cambridge University. Okay, we now come to a biggie, the Dead Sea Scrolls, famously discovered in 1946 at Qumran, arguably one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. Loads of documents were found, ranging in dates from 300 BCE to 100 CE. There were portions or fragments from every part of the Tanakh except for the Book of Esther. Most notable was a mostly intact near-complete scroll of the book of Isaiah. But there were also several apocryphal books found, as well as documents relating to the Jewish community that lived at Qumran. So the main thing you need to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they're not some sort of alternative Bible. They are simply copies of the Bible that we already had, as well as some copies of some non-biblical writings. And the important thing is that they actually confirm that the copy of the Hebrew Bible we have today is pretty much the same as the copy of the Hebrew Bible that was around during the time of Jesus. Remember how I mentioned earlier that prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest version of the Tanakh that we had in Hebrew was the Masoretic Text, which dates much later to around 1000 CE. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic Text pretty much line up perfectly, meaning that although 1000 years passed between them, the scribes actually did a very good job at copying things accurately. Sure, there are some minor differences, mostly variations in spelling, shown here in green, but there are no examples where an entire story was changed in some dramatic way. This screenshot here is actually from a great website called dssenglishbible.com. I'll link to that in the description. It shows you exactly what the differences are between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic Text, the red words being the ones that are slightly different. Okay, so what could be older than the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, coming in at number 1, representing the oldest text of the Bible ever found, is the ketefhinnom scrolls. Notice that I had to extend the timescale so that I could fit their estimated date of 650 BCE on there. Now, these are not actually manuscripts per se. They are tiny amulets of rolled silver, but on them are inscribed letters written in a very old Hebrew script that match the text of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. This passage is known as the priestly blessing, and it is still used in Jewish synagogues today, which is cool because we know that these words are at least 2,650 years old, being the only words from the entire Bible that can be archaeologically placed prior to the destruction of the First Temple. And here's another cool fact about the priestly blessing. When a member of the Kohanim, who are thought to be the descendants of the original Jewish priests, says this blessing, they hold their hands like this. A certain Jew by the name of Leonard Nimoy remembered seeing this as a kid, and it served as the inspiration for what has become known as the Vulcan salute. So basically, the ketefhinnom scrolls are a 2,600-year-old version of Live Long and Prosper. Okay, now that I have introduced you to some of the oldest Bible manuscripts, I'd like to end by discussing what it all means when it comes to the historical method. Supposedly, the famous Christian evangelist Billy Graham once said that there is more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead than there is that Julius Caesar ever lived. This is an idea that continues to be floated by some Christians today. And in fact, it even comes up in the comments on this channel every now and then. The argument usually involves a chart that looks something like this. We see listed here several works of ancient literature, including that of the New Testament. It then lists two key pieces of information. The first is the amount of time between when the work was written and the earliest manuscript we have of that work. So, for example, the chart tells us that the gap for Tacitus is 750 years, but the gap for the New Testament is only 30 years. Secondly, the chart lists the total number of manuscripts we have for each piece of writing. So again, according to this chart, we have only 36 manuscripts for Tacitus, but we have a whopping 5,856 for the New Testament. Now, there are three major problems with this chart. The first is that it is extremely misleading. At first glance, one might assume that we have close to 6,000 complete manuscripts of the New Testament, all of which date close to 30 years after they were written. If this were true, it would indeed be pretty impressive, but it's not. Let me show you a different chart. So far, the number of manuscripts we have from the 1st century, which is when Jesus lived and when most of the New Testament was written, is 0. And from the 2nd century, we have a grand total of 4. And all of those are extremely small fragments. I mentioned 3 of them in this video, the oldest being the Rhylands Papyrus. Now, it is in fact true that the Rhylands Papyrus might date to a mere 30 years after the original. But keep in mind that the Rhylands Papyrus is by no means a complete copy of the New Testament. It's just a tiny piece of paper with a few lines on it, as are all the other 2nd century manuscripts. When we get to the 3rd century, the number of manuscripts goes up to around 50. And here we get for the first time a few that contain complete books, such as the Pauline epistles from the Chester Beady collection and the Gospels of Luke and John from the Bodmer collection. However, the vast majority of those 50 are still very small fragments. Moving on to the 4th and 5th centuries, the number of manuscripts goes up to around 100, and it is here that we get the 4 great Unseals, the only 4 complete New Testaments in Greek that have survived from ancient times. Everything else is just fragments or partial manuscripts. We then get another 350 or so from 500 to 1000 CE, meaning that the vast majority of that 5,856 number comes from after the year 1000. So this certainly paints a bit of a different picture. But my second point is that from the perspective of the historical method, the total number of manuscripts is not really all that important. Christianity has been the dominant religion in Europe for the last 2,000 years, so it's not surprising that there are a lot of copies of its most important text. What's more important to a historian is whether or not a manuscript is authentic, and there are a variety of ways to determine this, beyond just counting the number of copies we have. In fact, so long as we have just one complete manuscript that we can somehow determine is authentic, that's all we really need. Everything else is just gravy. Finally, from the perspective of the historical method, the size of the gap between when the text was written and the oldest manuscript we have of that text is also not as important as you might think. What's more important than the age of the manuscript is the age of the writing itself and the genre in which it was written. Like I said, historians have several methods for dating texts, one of which involves linguistic analysis. So, in other words, if we have just one copy of an authentic text that we can be certain was written by Julius Caesar himself, it doesn't really matter whether that manuscript is 100 years old or 1,000 years old. 100 years old would be nice, but so long as we can use other methods to determine that Julius Caesar actually wrote it, the 1,000-year-old copy will do. So for example, we have 251 copies of the Gallic Wars, written by Julius Caesar, the earliest of which dates to about 850 years after the original. This work of literature was written by Caesar himself, perhaps with the assistance of a scribe, and it is based on Caesar's own eyewitness account of the fight between the Romans and the Gauls. Sure, it might involve some exaggeration and propaganda, but generally speaking, it's a relatively straightforward non-fiction account of what happened. Contrast this with the 4 Gospels, which were not actually written by Jesus himself. Sure, they most likely do contain some of the actual words of Jesus, but remember, these would have been translated from the original Aramaic to Greek, and each Gospel as a whole was written by an author who was likely writing 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, and who was trying to make certain theological points, rather than simply record a series of events. So if I had to place a wager on who was more likely to have been a real historical person, I'd place my bet on Caesar. Of course, such a forced choice is not actually necessary. I firmly believe, as do most historians, that both Caesar and Jesus were real historical people. Now, as to whether or not the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus is 100% accurate, well, that's another question. But the point is, we have good evidence for the existence of both people. So that was a look at some of the oldest Bible manuscripts found so far, and what those manuscripts mean from a historical point of view. If you think that there's a manuscript that I should have mentioned but did not, be sure to leave a comment. Thanks for watching.